Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we ride into a story of love, loss, and the cold steel of justice, a tale of a gentle hand forced to hold a gun, do us a solid and hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell, too, because you won't want to miss a single legend from the untamed heart of the American West. Now, settle in and listen to the story of the woman they came to call the widow with the revolver. The love between Clara and Ben Carter was a quiet, simple thing, as sturdy and as honest as the small ranch they were carving out of the wild Arizona territory. It was a life measured not in gold, but in the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of a well-mended fence, and the shared, silent understanding that passed between them in the golden light of a prairie sunset. Ben was a man of the law, the marshal of the small, hopeful town of Sanctuary, but he wore his badge with a quiet humility. He was a rancher at heart, a man who believed in the slow, steady work of building a community, not in the quick, bloody finality of the gun. His dream was a simple one: a few dozen head of cattle, a field of corn, and a lifetime of sunrises with the woman he loved. Clara was the heart of that dream. Her hands, though gentle, were never idle, tending to her garden, running their small home, and mending the fabric of their life with a quiet, resilient strength. She had a spirit that refused to be bowed by the harshness of the land. She was his peace, his anchor in a world that was often anything but peaceful. This particular afternoon was like any other. Ben was in the corral, his back strong and steady as he worked to gentle a new colt. Clara was on the porch, mending one of his shirts, the familiar, comforting rhythm of the needle a quiet counterpoint to the nicker of the horses and the buzz of the cicadas. A gentle breeze carried the scent of dust and sweet clover. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind of moment upon which a happy life is built. The arrival of the three riders was a discordant note in this symphony of peace. They appeared on the horizon, three dark shapes against the blazing sun, moving with an arrogant, predatory slowness. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She recognized the man in the lead, Cyrus Thorne, a ruthless land baron from the north, a man whose ambition was a cancer on the territory. Thorne wanted their land, not for its meager grazing, but for the one thing that made it truly valuable: the deep, year-round spring that fed their ranch, the only reliable water source for 50 miles. Ben, as marshal, had legally denied Thorne's fraudulent claim to the spring a month earlier. It was an act of law, of justice. Clara now knew, with a sickening certainty, that Thorne had come to deliver his own, very different, kind of judgment. Ben saw them too. He walked out of the corral, his movements calm and deliberate, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He did not reach for the Colt peacemaker that hung on his hip, the gun he wore as a tool of his office but hated to use. He was a lawman, and he would meet this challenge with the law. "Thorne," Ben said, his voice even as the three men reined in their horses in a cloud of dust. "This is private property. You're not welcome here." Cyrus Thorne, a man with a neatly trimmed silver beard and eyes as cold and as dead as a winter snake's, looked down at Ben from his magnificent black stallion. A cruel, patronizing smile touched his lips. "Marshal Carter," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was utterly out of place in this dusty landscape. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The territorial court has reconsidered my claim to this land. You're trespassing." "You're a liar," Ben said, his voice flat, the anger now a low, dangerous rumble beneath the calm. "The circuit judge upheld my title. Now, I'm telling you for the last time. Get off my land." "Your land," Thorne chuckled. "A man's land is only what he can hold. And you, Marshal, are about to find that your grip is not as strong as you think." Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. One of his hired guns, a man with a face like a clenched fist, drew his revolver. Clara screamed, a raw, strangled sound. She jumped to her feet, the mending basket tumbling from her lap. The world seemed to slow, to warp. She saw Ben's hand finally move, a blur of motion toward the gun he had never wanted to use. But he was a man of peace, and he was a fraction of a second too slow. The shot was a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon calm. It was not Thorne's man who fired. It was Thorne himself, a small, elegant derringer appearing in his hand as if by magic. The bullet struck Ben in the chest. He was thrown backward, a look of profound, shocked disbelief on his face. His hand, which had almost reached his gun, fell to his side. His eyes found Clara's, and in them, she saw a universe of lost sunrises, of unfulfilled promises, of a love so deep it was a physical pain. He tried to speak her name, but only a bloody sigh escaped his lips. He crumpled to the dust, and the perfect, ordinary moment was gone forever. Clara was frozen, paralyzed by a grief so vast and so sudden it had no sound. The hired guns dismounted, their faces impassive. They walked over to Ben's body and unbuckled his gun belt, taking the Colt Peacemaker, the symbol of his authority, as a trophy. Thorne remained mounted, looking down at the scene with the detached air of a man examining a business transaction. "A pity," Thorne said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He looked at Clara, his cold eyes dismissing her as nothing more than a piece of furniture, a part of the property he had just acquired. "You have until sunrise to be gone. Take what you can carry. The rest now belongs to me." He turned his horse, and the three of them rode away, their laughter a cruel, obscene sound that hung in the suddenly silent air. They left her alone with the body of her husband, the wreckage of her life, and the vast, indifferent sky. That night, under a cold blanket of stars, Clara dug a grave. She worked with a frantic, desperate strength, her hands raw, her mind a numb, echoing void. She wrapped Ben in their wedding quilt and laid him to rest on the small hill overlooking the home they had built together. As the first, pale light of dawn touched the fresh-turned earth, she knelt by the grave. The time for tears was over. The grief had burned away, leaving something hard and cold in its place. She looked at her left hand, at the simple, gold wedding band that had been the symbol of her entire world. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it from her finger. The skin beneath was pale, a ghostly imprint of a life that was now over. She did not toss it aside. She dug a small hole in the earth of Ben's grave and placed the ring inside, covering it over. She was burying her past, her love, her very self, with him. It was a vow of finality, a severing. But as she stood, her eyes fell upon the gun belt Thorne's men had contemptuously tossed aside near the porch. She walked over and picked it up. It was heavy, the leather worn smooth by Ben's hand, the Colt Peacemaker nestled in its holster. She pulled the gun free. It was a cold, heavy, alien thing in her hand, a stark and brutal contrast to the delicate ring she had just buried. Her soft, gentle hands, which had known only the needle, the spade, and the loving touch of her husband, now closed around the cold, checkered grip of a killer's tool. She looked from the grave to the gun, from a symbol of love to a symbol of death. And in that moment, a new, terrible vow was forged in the fire of her loss. She would not mourn. She would not run. She would take up the one thing her husband had left behind. She would seek not vengeance, but a brutal, final accounting. The justice of the law had failed him. Now, he would have hers. The sun rose higher, and the heat of the Arizona morning began to beat down on the small, lonely hill. Clara stood before her husband's grave, a statue carved from grief. The woman who had been a wife, a partner, a gentle soul, was gone, buried in the dark earth along with a small gold ring. What remained was something new, something informed and terrifying, holding a weight of cold, polished steel in her hand. The Colt Peacemaker felt impossibly heavy. It was not just the physical weight of the metal, but the symbolic weight of what it represented. This was Ben's gun. He had worn it not as a threat, but as a promise of protection, of order, of the fragile peace he had worked so hard to build. He had hated the violence it stood for, yet he had accepted it as a necessary burden of his office. Now, that burden was hers. Her hand, which had trembled as she buried her ring, was now unnervingly steady as she gripped the revolver. She raised it, the long barrel catching the morning light. She looked down the sights, across the land that had been hers, toward the distant, hazy mountains. This was the view Ben had seen, the world he had sworn to protect. Now, it was a world she had to navigate as a hunter. "I will not let them win, Ben," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing in the vast silence. "I will not let your life be a forgotten postscript in Thorne's greedy ledger. They took our future. I will take theirs. I swear it. On your grave, I swear it." Her vow was not a cry of rage, but a statement of cold, hard fact. It was a promise sealed not with a kiss, but with the click of a hammer being thumbed back. She knew she couldn't stay. Thorne's deadline of sunrise had passed. His men would be back soon to claim their prize. She went back into the small cabin for the last time. The space, once filled with the warmth of love and shared life, was now a hollow, echoing shell. She moved with a grim purpose, not packing as a woman fleeing, but equipping as a soldier preparing for a campaign. She took only what was essential: a small sack of dried jerky and hardtack, a canteen, Ben's spare ammunition, and from a locked chest under their bed, she took a map of the territory and a small, heavy pouch of coins, their life savings. Finally, she took Ben's old, worn duster from its peg by the door. She slipped it on. It was too big for her, but as she wrapped it around herself, she felt a strange, comforting echo of his presence, a final, fleeting warmth before the long cold set in. She led their 2 horses from the corral, turning them loose. She could not take them where she was going. She would travel on foot, a ghost, leaving as small a trail as possible. She gave the mare, her personal favorite, a final pat on the neck, a goodbye to the last vestige of her old life. Her destination was a place of legend, a place Ben had spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. Deep in the Superstition Mountains lived a man named Silas Kane, known in his younger, bloodier days as the Ghost of the Sierra. He was a retired gunslinger, a man who had seen more than his share of violence and had, for reasons of his own, walked away from it all to live as a recluse. Ben had once sought his counsel on a matter of tracking a particularly cunning outlaw. He had described a man as hard and as timeless as the mountains themselves, a man who understood the dark heart of the West. If anyone could teach her how to turn her grief into a weapon, it was him. The journey into the mountains was a crucible. The land was harsh and forgiving. She moved with a grim, relentless determination, her sorrow a fuel that burned away her fatigue. She learned to be silent, to be patient, to read the subtle language of the land. The soft woman from the ranch was being scoured away, leaving a core of hard, resilient steel. She found his cabin after a week of walking, a small, stone and timber structure nestled in a high, hidden canyon, almost invisible against the rock face. An old man sat on the porch, cleaning a long rifle, a pair of cold, pale eyes watching her approach. "That's far enough," Silas Kane said, his voice the sound of rocks grinding together. The rifle in his lap was pointed in her general direction. "This is a private canyon. Turn around." Clara stopped. She was exhausted, covered in dust, but she stood tall. "My name is Clara Carter," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My husband was Marshall Ben Carter, of Sanctuary. He is dead, murdered. He spoke of you. He said you were a man who understood justice. I'm a man who understands that justice is a fool's game, and the house always wins," Silas grunted, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want from me, Mrs. Carter?" "I want you to teach me how to use this," she said. She did not draw the Colt from its holster. She simply patted the worn leather at her hip. "I want you to teach me how to make the men who killed my husband pay for what they did." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines. Silas looked at her, at the raw and plumb depths of the grief in her eyes, and at the unshakable iron of her will. He saw a reflection of a fire he had thought was long extinguished in himself. "Vengeance is a hungry ghost, girl," he said, his voice heavy. "You feed it, and it will eat you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but a hollow shell." "My life is already a hollow shell," Clara replied, her voice unwavering. "All I have left is this debt. I will see it paid, with your help, or without it." Silas stared at her for another long moment. Then, with a slow, weary sigh, he rested the rifle against the cabin wall. "The first lesson is this," he said grimly. "The gun is not the weapon. You are. The gun is just the voice you use to speak. Right now, you're whispering. I will teach you how to make them hear you scream." He had agreed. The woman who had been a wife was now a student. The rancher's widow was about to be reforged in the cold and forgiving fire of a killer's tutelage, and the weight of the steel in her hand was beginning to feel less like a burden, and more like a promise. The Superstition Mountains became Clara's forge, and Silas Kane was her unforgiving hammer. The old gunslinger stripped away every trace of the gentle, hesitant woman she had been, and hammered her, day after day, against the anvil of his own brutal experience. He was not a kind teacher. He saw the path she was determined to walk, and he knew that sentimentality was a luxury that would get her killed. He started with her body, pushing her through a grueling regimen that hardened her muscles and sharpened her endurance. He taught her to live with pain, to ignore exhaustion, to draw strength not from hope, but from the cold, hard rock of her own will. Then came the lessons of the mind. He taught her to be a hunter, to track a man through the most rugged terrain, to read the meaning in a broken twig or a displaced stone. He taught her to be patient, to be still, to become a part of the landscape, the ghost in the rocks and shadows. Finally, came the gun, Ben's cold peacemaker. He made her practice the draw 1,000 times a day, until her arm was a single, fluid extension of her intent. He taught her that speed was a lie told by dime novelists. The truth was in efficiency, in the cold, calm economy of motion that brought the gun to bear a fraction of a second before her opponents. He taught her to shoot not just at targets, but at opportunities, to see the battlefield with a cold, tactical clarity. "You're not aiming at a man," he would say, his voice a low growl. "You're aiming at a life, a future, a story. You have to be willing to end it, without hesitation, without remorse. If you can't do that, then you should put this gun down right now and go find a convent." During this time, Clara never spoke of her husband. She locked his memory, the memory of her love, away in a cold, dark room in her heart. To remember the warmth would be to weaken her resolve. Her grief was not a source of sorrow, it was a whetstone, and she sharpened herself against it every single day. After a year, Silas declared her ready. She was no longer a student. She was a weapon, honed to a razor's edge. She stood before him, leaner, harder, her eyes holding a chilling, focused calm that mirrored his own. "Who's first?" he asked. "There were 2 hired guns with Thorn," she replied, her voice flat. "One of them, a man named Smiling Jack. He's a braggart. He'll be in some border town saloon, telling stories. And the other, I don't know his name," she said, "but I remember his face. I'll find him. And after them, Thorn." "After them," she confirmed, "Thorn." She rode down from the mountains, a different woman from the one who had staggered up their slopes a year before. The whispers began soon after. In the town of Bitter Creek, a notorious haven for outlaws, a loud-mouthed gunslinger named Smiling Jack, a man known to have worked for Cyrus Thorn, was found dead in a back alley. He had been shot once, cleanly, through the heart. The local law called it a gambling dispute, but the story the witnesses told was different. They spoke of a quiet, sad-eyed woman who had challenged him not to a fight, but to a conversation that had ended with a single, impossibly fast draw. 2 months later, in a dusty mining camp, another of Thorn's known enforcers was killed. This time, it was a knife fight, a brutal, close-quarters affair that left the man dead, and the victor vanished into the night. The only description anyone could give was of a woman with a will of iron and the eyes of a ghost. The stories began to coalesce. They were tied together by a common thread. The victims were all men connected to the powerful Cyrus Thorn, and the avenger was always a woman, a lone, quiet figure who appeared, delivered her justice, and then disappeared. They didn't know her name, but they needed something to call her. And so, from the hushed whispers in a dozen dusty towns, a legend was born. They called her the widow with the revolver. Clara heard the whispers. She had not sought a reputation, but she understood its power. The legend was a shield, an armor of fear that would make her next steps easier. Her final target, before Thorn himself, was the second man from that day, the man whose face was burned into her memory. Her hunt for him led her to the town of Redemption, a place ironically named, for it was a town drowning in sin, completely under the thumb of a corrupt sheriff in Cyrus Thorn's pocket. She found her man there. His name was Marcus, and he was now a deputy, a legal thug for Thorn's puppet lawmen. He was arrogant, brutal, and secure in his position of power. Clara knew she couldn't just call him out in the street. The whole town was a hostile force. She had to isolate him. She learned that he had a weakness, a weekly, high-stakes poker game he played in a private room above the saloon. She set her stage. She did not enter the saloon as a gunslinger, but as a lady of the evening, her face hidden by a heavy veil, her presence unassuming. She used her looks, a tool she had long forgotten she possessed, to get access to the upper floor. She found the room. She did not burst in. She waited outside the door until the game was over, until Marcus, flush with winnings and whiskey, was alone. She entered, locking the door behind her. He looked up, a leering, drunken smile on his face. "Well now, looks like my luck's still running." "Your luck ran out the day you rode to the Carter Ranch," she said, her voice low and clear. She pulled back her veil. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a flicker of fear, which was quickly replaced by an arrogant sneer. "The marshal's wife," he chuckled. "I should have known. Come to beg for a little company." "No," she said, and Ben's Colt was in her hand, its barrel cold and steady. "I've come to deliver my husband's final judgment." His own gun was on the table, just out of reach. His face went pale. The fear returned, stark and absolute. "Please," he stammered. "It was just a job. Thorne paid us." "I know," she said, "and I am the one who has come to collect the debt." She did not kill him then. She made him talk. She made him tell her everything. The names of the other men in Thorne's employ. The location of Thorne's main ranch, the Thorne Dominion. The details of his operations. She was not just a killer, she was a general, gathering intelligence for her final battle. When he had told her everything he knew, when he was a weeping, pathetic wreck, she looked at him with a cold, final pity. "My husband was a good man," she said, her voice a near whisper. "He deserved to grow old. He deserved a life. You helped turn him to dust." The Colt roared, the sound deafening in the small room. She left Marcus dead at his card table, his final hand a losing one. She slipped out of the saloon in the ensuing chaos, her face once again hidden by the veil. She had the last piece of the puzzle. She knew where to find Cyrus Thorne. Her long, bloody apprenticeship was over. The widow was now coming for the man who had made her. The road to the Thorne Dominion was a journey through a landscape of memory and doubt. With Thorne's hired killers dead, the path to the architect of her misery was now clear. But as Clara rode north, the cold, sharp focus of the hunt began to blur. The faces of the men she had killed were a constant presence, their final moments of terror replaying in the quiet hours of the night. The weight of Ben's revolver on her hip felt heavier than ever, each bullet she had fired a chip taken from her own soul. She was passing through a high, arid plateau when she saw the smoke. It was not the gentle plume of a campfire, but the thick, black, greasy smoke of a structure on fire. Her first instinct, the instinct of the widow, was to ride on. It was not her business. Her business was with Cyrus Thorne. But another voice, a quieter one, the voice of the woman who had been Marshal Carter's wife, urged her to investigate. She found a small, isolated homestead, a modest sod house, engulfed in flames. A woman was on her knees in the dirt, weeping, while her husband was desperately trying to lead their panicked horses from a burning corral. A small boy, no older than 5, stood watching, his face streaked with tears and soot, his eyes wide with a terror that Clara knew all too well. A group of riders were watching the destruction from a nearby ridge, their laughter a cruel, familiar sound. She recognized their brand. They were men from a rival cattle operation, using violence and intimidation to drive the smaller homesteaders out. It was a story as old and as ugly as the land itself. Clara looked at the small family, at their life being turned to ash, and she saw herself. She saw the ghost of her own past, her own destroyed home, her own stolen future. In the face of their raw, immediate grief, her own quest for vengeance suddenly felt like a cold, selfish thing. What good was avenging one dead man if she was to stand by and watch another family be destroyed? The decision was not a conscious one. It was a visceral, overwhelming reaction. The widow, for a moment, receded, and Clara Carter, the marshal's wife, acted. She did not ride in with guns blazing. That was not Ben's way. She circled around, using a low ravine to approach the riders from behind. She was a ghost, her movements silent, her presence unknown. She did not wear a mask of vengeance, but one of quiet, deadly authority. The first of the riders, a man who had lingered behind the main group, found his horse's reins suddenly seized. Before he could react, the cold muzzle of a Colt was pressed against his temple. "You and your friends are going to ride away," Clara said, her voice a low, calm, but unyielding command. "You are not going to look back. And you are never going to come to this valley again. Am I understood?" The man, terrified by the sudden appearance of the armed woman, could only nod, his eyes wide. "Tell your friends," she added, "that this valley is under the protection of Marshal Carter. His memory is long, and his justice is swift." She let the man go. He scrambled to rejoin his group, his panicked words sending a wave of confusion through them. They looked back and saw her, a lone woman on a horse, not a fearsome legend, but a figure of simple, unshakable resolve. They were bullies, not warriors. Confused, unnerved, and unwilling to fight an unknown battle, they did as they were told. They rode away. Clara watched them go. Then she rode down to the homestead. The fire had already consumed most of the sod house. She helped the man, whose name was Samuel, get the last of his horses to safety. She helped his wife, Sarah, tend to a burn on her arm. She said little, and they, seeing the deep, profound sorrow in her eyes, did not ask questions. They worked together through the night, salvaging what little they could from the ruins. As dawn broke, Samuel stood with her, looking at the smoldering remains of his home. "They destroyed it all," he said, his voice thick with despair. "Everything we worked for." "No," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. She gestured to his wife and his son, who were huddled together nearby. "They didn't destroy that. You can rebuild a house. You can't rebuild a family. Believe me, I know." She gave them a third of the money she had left, a significant portion of her war chest. "To start again," she said, pressing the pouch into Samuel's hand before he could protest. She rode away as the sun was rising, leaving the grateful but bewildered family behind. The act of helping them, of protecting them, had changed her. It had not extinguished the fire of her hatred for Thorn, but it had reminded her of what she was truly fighting for. It wasn't just about death. It was about the life that had been stolen. She had been so focused on the promise she had made to the dead that she had forgotten her responsibility to the living. The weight of Ben's revolver on her hip felt different now. It was not just an instrument of vengeance. It was a tool of protection. It was a promise. Not just to avenge the past, but to fight for the possibility of a future, for others, if not for herself. Her internal war was not over, but for the first time, the part of her that was Clara was fighting back against the all-consuming shadow of the widow. And it was with this new, complex, and painful clarity that she finally rode toward her final battle. The Thorn Dominion was not a ranch, it was an empire built on a foundation of stolen land and broken lives. It sprawled across 1,000 acres of the territory's best grazing land, its heart a massive, two-story ranch house built of imported timber and stone, a monument to Cyrus Thorn's arrogance. It was a fortress, not a home, and since the news of his last two enforcers' deaths, Thorn had made it a literal one. He had hired a small army of gunslingers, 20 of the hardest, most amoral men a payroll could buy. They patrolled the perimeter day and night. Snipers were posted in the hayloft of the massive barn and on the roof of the main house. Thorn had turned his kingdom into a cage, and he sat in the center of it like a bloated spider, waiting for the fly he knew was coming. Clara knew, as she scouted the Dominion from a distant, pine-covered ridge, that a direct assault was impossible. She was one woman with a revolver, against a private army. Her skills were in stealth and precision, not in open warfare. To defeat Thorn, she couldn't just be a better gunslinger, she had to be a better general. She had to dismantle his army before she could ever get to the king. Her campaign began not with bullets, but with fear and doubt. She knew that men like the ones Thorn had hired were loyal only to coin, their courage only as strong as their belief in their own safety. She would shatter that belief. She became a ghost in the vastness of the Thorn Dominion. She started by targeting their sense of security. A lone sentry, riding the far fence line, would return to the bunkhouse to find his saddlebag slit and his whiskey flask filled with sand. A guard post, which should have been manned by 2 men, would be found empty, the men's rifles and ammunition gone, and a single, dead rattlesnake coiled on the seat where they should have been. She never showed herself. She never fired a shot. She just left her calling card small, and settling signs that they were being watched by an enemy who could move among them, unseen and untouchable. The gunslingers, who had signed on for what they thought was an easy job guarding a rich man, began to grow jumpy. The vast, empty landscape, which had once seemed a symbol of their employer's power, now felt like a claustrophobic trap. They started firing at shadows, arguing amongst themselves. The legend of the widow with the revolver, which they had laughed off as a campfire story, now felt chillingly real. Next, she targeted their resources. The wagon that brought their weekly supplies of food and ammunition from the nearest town was found overturned in a ravine, its contents gone, its driver and guard tied to a tree and harmed. But with a story of being ambushed by a silent, phantom force that had simply taken what it wanted and vanished. Thorn was furious. His hired army was becoming a nervous, bickering wreck. He doubled the patrols, offered bonuses, threatened executions for desertion. But he could not fight an enemy he could not see. He was a king whose castle walls were being rendered meaningless because the enemy was already inside. Clara knew it was time to escalate, to deliver a blow that would shatter their morale completely. She learned that Thorn kept his prized breeding bull's future of his cattle empire, worth a fortune, in a separate, well-guarded stone corral a mile from the main house. This was the heart of his ambition, the symbol of the legacy he was trying to build. She planned her attack for a moonless, stormy night, when the wind and the rain would be her accomplices. The attack was a masterpiece of misdirection. She started a fire, a small, controlled blaze, in a hay shed on the far eastern edge of the ranch. As most of the guards, including Thorn himself, raced to fight the fire, a perceived direct assault, Clara was moving toward her real target. She dealt with the two guards at the bullpen with a silent, brutal efficiency. She did not kill them. She used a heavy rock to knock one unconscious and a chokehold to disable the other. She was a ghost of pure, thoughtless violence. She did not harm the bulls. She simply opened the heavy gates of the stone corral. Then, using a series of small, firecracker-like charges Silas had taught her to make, she spooked the massive animals. The bulls, a ton each of an enraged, stampeding fury, burst from the corral and thundered off into the darkness and the storm, a fortune in livestock scattered to the four winds. When Thorn and his men returned from the decoy fire, they found their two guards bound and gagged, and the bullpen empty. And burned into the main gate with a branding iron was a single, stark message, a crudely drawn pair of scales, the symbol of justice. This was the final straw. The loss of the bulls was a devastating financial and psychological blow. For the hired guns, it was a sign that they were guarding a doomed enterprise. They were not just fighting a ghost. They were fighting a symbol, a force that could not be stopped. That morning, half of them deserted, taking their pay and riding away, wanting no more part in Thorn's cursed war. Thorn was left with a skeleton crew, his fortress half empty, his empire crumbling. He was a man consumed by a rabid, impotent fury. He knew she was coming for him now. The game was over. He sent the last of his men to the main house, ordering them to barricade the doors and windows. He was making his last stand in the monument to his own greed. The widow had dismantled his army without firing a single fatal shot. Now, she was coming to collect the final debt from the man himself. The day of the reckoning dawned clear and cold. A storm had passed in the night, washing the dust from the air and leaving the world with a sharp, brittle clarity. The Thorn Dominion was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of a working ranch replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Cyrus Thorn and his remaining 8 gunslingers were holed up in the main house, a stone and timber fortress, every window a dark, watchful eye. Clara had watched the desertions from her hiding place in the hills. She had seen Thorn's army cut in half, his confidence shattered. Now was the time. She would not wait for darkness. She would not use stealth. This final act had to be done in the full light of day. It had to be a direct, unequivocal statement. She rode out from the pines, a solitary figure on the vast, open plain leading to the ranch house. She was not the widow, a legend of the shadows. She was Clara Carter, a woman wronged, coming to balance the ledger. She held Ben's revolver in her hand, not holstered, but held loosely at her side, a declaration of her purpose. The first shot came from a sniper on the roof when she was still 200 yards out. The bullet kicked up a plume of dust a few feet to her left. It was a warning. She didn't flinch. She kept her horse at a slow, deliberate walk, her eyes fixed on the house. Another shot, this one closer. She dismounted, giving her horse a final pat on the neck and sending it galloping away to safety. She was on foot now, alone, walking toward a fortress of armed men. It was a suicidal act, an impossible challenge. But she had an ally that Thorn had not accounted for. As she began her long walk, and his sound was hard thunder of hoofbeats. It was not a single horse, but dozens. Over the rise behind her came a small, determined army. It was Samuel and the homesteaders she had saved, their faces set with a grim resolve. It was the independent loggers who had been terrorized by Goliath, men who had heard the story of the widow and had come to pay a debt. It was a collection of the forgotten, the oppressed, the victims of men like Cyrus Thorne. They were not gunslingers, but they were men and women fighting for their homes, for their lives, for a chance at a world free of bullies and tyrants. Thorne, watching from an upstairs window, saw his one-on-one siege turn into a full-blown battle. His face, which had been a mask of confident fury, contorted into a snarl of disbelief and rage. The battle for the Thorne Dominion was not a clean, tactical affair. It was a chaotic, desperate, and bloody brawl. Clara's impromptu army, while not disciplined, fought with a righteous fury. They used their farm wagons for cover, their hunting rifles and shotguns a constant, harassing fire against the fortified house. Clara was not their general, but their inspiration. She moved with a deadly, focused grace, a whirlwind at the center of the storm. She was not fighting a war, she was executing a plan. She ignored the main house, her target was the barn. The snipers in the hayloft were the greatest threat. She used the chaos of the main battle as her cover, circling around to the back of the massive structure. She slipped inside, a ghost in the hay-scented gloom. The two snipers in the loft were so focused on the fight in front of the house that they never heard her ascend the ladder. She dealt with them with a brutal, silent efficiency. She was no longer just a gunslinger, she was a soldier. From her new vantage point in the hayloft, she had a clear line of sight into the second-story windows of the main house. She began a methodical, deadly counter-sniper campaign. She was not shooting to kill, but to neutralize. A rifle barrel protruding from a window was her target. A man's shoulder. A hand. She was dismantling Thorne's defense from the inside out, her every shot a testament to the brutal, year-long tutelage of Silas Kane. One by one, the gunslingers inside the house were wounded, their will to fight draining away with their blood. They were paid mercenaries, not fanatics. They were not being paid enough to die for this cursed ranch. They threw down their guns and surrendered, emerging from the house with their hands held high. The fighting stopped. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The homesteaders had won, but Clara's fight was not over. Cyrus Thorne had not surrendered. He was still in the house. Alone. She descended from the barn, Ben's revolver now back in her hand. The crowd of homesteaders parted for her, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. She walked across the yard, littered with the detritus of the battle, and up the steps of the grand ranch house. The door was barricaded. The blacksmith she had met in Redemption, who had joined the posse, came forward with a heavy sledgehammer. "Allow me, ma'am," he said. He shattered the door with 3 powerful blows. Clara stepped through, into the lion's den. She was no longer a victim, no longer a student, no longer just a widow. She was the culmination of her own story, a promise kept in gunsmoke. The inside of Cyrus Thorne's ranch house was a testament to his greed. The floors were polished hardwood, the walls hung with expensive tapestries, and a grand staircase, its banister carved from dark, rich mahogany, dominated the entryway. It was a palace built on stolen dreams, and now it was a tomb, silent and waiting. The air was thick with the smell of gunsmoke and the metallic tang of fear. Clara moved through the opulent rooms with a slow, deliberate caution. Ben's revolver felt like a living thing in her hand, a steady, reassuring weight. She was not a hunter in the wilderness now, she was an infiltrator in an enemy fortress. Every shadow was a potential ambush, every closed door a threat. She found him in his study. It was a room designed to project power, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with red leather-bound volumes, a massive desk, and a large window that looked out over the empire he had built. He was not cowering behind the desk. He was standing by the window, a glass of brandy in one hand, a large-caliber dragoon revolver in the other. He was dressed impeccably, as if for a formal occasion. He had been defeated, but he would not be broken. He turned as she entered, and his cold, snake's eyes met hers. There was no fear in them, only a deep, abiding, and utterly contemptuous hatred. "So," he said, his voice a low, cultured sneer. "The grieving widow. I must confess, you've been far more trouble than I anticipated. A testament to your husband's poor judgment in choosing such a resilient spouse." My husband's only poor judgment was believing a man like you could have a shred of honor, Clara replied, her voice cold and steady. She raised the Colt, its barrel aimed directly at his heart. Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He took a sip of his brandy. Honor, he mused. Honor is a luxury for men who can't afford to buy what they want. I wanted this valley. I wanted your water. Your husband was an obstacle. I removed him. It was a simple business transaction. Your mistake was in taking it personally. You destroyed my life, she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper, the raw grief of that day afresh wound. You turned me into this. I revealed what was already there, Thorne retorted, his eyes glinting. Don't blame me for the monster you've become. You seem to have a talent for it. You should thank me. I gave you a purpose. His words were poison, designed to twist the knife, to make her doubt the very foundation of her quest. But she would not be moved. The only purpose you gave me was to see you dead. Then let us conclude our business, he said. He placed his brandy glass carefully on the desk and raised the big dragoon revolver. The bore of the gun was a dark, cavernous hole. The shootout in the study was not a prolonged, chaotic battle. It was a brutal, final, and intimate exchange. It was a clash of two opposing wills, two irreconcilable truths, condensed into a few, deafening seconds. Thorne fired first. The big dragoon roared, the sound of physical blow in the enclosed space. The heavy slug tore through the air, smashing a porcelain vase on the mantelpiece behind Clara, showering her with fragments. He was a powerful man, but his rage made him imprecise. Clara's shot was different. It was not fired in rage. It was fired with a cold serene and absolute certainty. It was the culmination of a year of training, of 100 sleepless nights, of a promise made on a fresh grave. It was a shot guided not by hate, but by a deep, abiding love for the man whose gun she held. Ben's Colt Peacemaker bucked in her hand. The bullet, the last bullet she would ever fire in vengeance, flew true. It struck Cyrus Thorne in the chest, in the same spot where his own bullet had struck down Ben Carter. The big revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering to the polished floor. A look of profound, almost philosophical, surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his pristine white shirt, then back up at her. His cold, snake's eyes held not hatred now, but a final, dawning understanding. He had been weighed, he had been measured, and he had been found wanting. He collapsed, his body crumpling behind his massive desk, the symbol of his power now his tombstone. Clara stood, the smoking revolver held at her side. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that seemed to be measuring a time that no longer had any meaning. The great weight that had driven her, the all-consuming purpose that had defined her, was gone. She walked over to the desk and looked down at the body of the man who had destroyed her world. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. The roaring fire in her soul had been quenched, leaving behind only a cold, gray, and desolate landscape of ash. She had paid the debt in full. She had kept her promise. But the cost, she was now beginning to truly understand, was a stolen life of her own. The silence that descended upon the Thorne dominion after the final shot was a heavy, profound thing. The homesteaders, who had been waiting with a tense, breathless anticipation, slowly began to emerge from their cover. They saw Clara appear in the doorway of the great ranch house, a solitary, weary figure, Ben's revolver held loosely at her side. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, her eyes holding a sorrow so deep it seemed to absorb the bright afternoon light. They knew, without a word being spoken, that it was over. No one cheered. The moment was too heavy, too somber for celebration. They had won their freedom, but it had been purchased at a terrible price, a price paid most dearly by the woman who stood before them. They approached her not as a hero, but as a mourner, their faces a mixture of gratitude, pity, and awe. Samuel, the homesteader whose family she had saved, was the first to speak. "It's done, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given us our homes back. You've given us a future." Clara looked at him, at his wife and his young son who stood beside him, and for the first time, she saw not a reflection of her own loss, but a flicker of hope. She had not just been an agent of destruction. She had been a catalyst for a new beginning. But it was their beginning, not hers. "What will you do now, Sarah?" Samuel's wife asked gently. Clara looked down at the revolver in her hand, then out at the vast, open country that stretched to the horizon. "I don't know," she whispered. "I truly don't know." She did not stay. She could not. The Thorn Dominion was a graveyard of ghosts, and she had no desire to be its caretaker. The homesteaders, with the sanction of the territory's overwhelmed and distant legal authorities, would divide the land and the assets, building a new, more just community from the ashes of Thorn's greed. Her part in the story was done. She rode away that afternoon, leaving behind the ranch, the people, and the legend she had become. She rode back toward the one place that felt like an ending, and perhaps a beginning. She rode back to Sanctuary. She arrived at the small hill overlooking the town as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land. The grave was just as she had left it, a simple, quiet mound of earth. She dismounted and knelt beside it, the silence of the evening settling around her like a soft blanket. She had fulfilled her vow. She had delivered a brutal, final justice. She had spoken for her husband in the only language his killers understood. But as she knelt there, the silence was not peaceful. It was empty. The rage, the grief, the all-consuming purpose that he had been her companions for so long. Without them, she was simply alone. She looked at the cold peacemaker in her hand. It was a beautiful, deadly thing. It had been her teacher, her protector, her voice. It was all she had left of Ben, and it was the symbol of the monster she had become. She could keep it, ride on, become the legend they whispered, a booth widow with the revolver, a wandering agent of justice. But she knew in her heart that was not a life. It was a haunting. She thought of what Ben would have wanted. He had hated the gun. He had dreamed of a day when he could hang it on the wall for good, a day when peace was not something that had to be defended with violence. With a resolve born of a deep, weary love, she began to dig. She used her bare hands, the same hands that had buried her ring, to scoop out a shallow hole in the earth beside the grave. She took a final look at the revolver, at its worn leather grip, its cold, blue steel. She remembered the weight of it in her hand, the power, the cost. Then, she laid it in the earth. She laid it to rest, a final, sleeping sentinel beside the man whose life it had been sworn to protect. She covered it over, patting the earth down, burying the last vestige of the widow. She stood, her hands now empty. For the first time in over a year, she was unarmed. She was not the widow. She was not the marshal's wife. She was just Clara, a woman who had walked through the deepest fire and had, somehow, survived. She did not know what the future held. The road ahead was a blank, terrifying, and unknown country. But as she turned her back on the grave, on the buried ring and the buried gun, and began to walk away, she felt not a sense of loss, but a quiet, fragile, and utterly profound sense of release. Her war was over. Her promise was kept. And for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The seasons turned, and the story of Cyrus Thorne's fall became a cornerstone of the territory's folklore. The homesteaders rebuilt, and the town of Sanctuary, free from the shadow of the Thorn Dominion, began to live up to its name. The legend of the widow with the revolver became a cautionary tale, a myth whispered around campfires. Some said she had ridden into Mexico and become a queen of the bandidos. Others said she had simply vanished into the desert, a ghost who had found her peace. No one knew the truth. Clara had walked away from that grave and had never looked back. She had traveled north, taking a new name, Hannah, a name with no history, no ghosts. She took a job as a seamstress in a small, bustling town in the Oregon Territory, a place of tall trees and green valleys, a world away from the sun-scorched landscapes of her past. She lived a life of deliberate, almost monastic, simplicity. She had a small room above the dress shop where she worked. She spoke little, kept to herself, and her hands, which had once been trained for the brutal efficiency of the gun, rediscovered the quiet, creative rhythm of the needle and thread. She was a ghost of a different sort now, a woman trying to become invisible, to outrun the echo of her own name. But the past was not a thing that could be so easily outrun. The West was a small world, and stories traveled with the dust on the wind. One day, a new family arrived in town, a man and a woman who had come up from the Arizona Territory, seeking a new start. The man was Samuel, the homesteader whose family she had saved from the fire. He saw her in the general store. He froze, his eyes wide with a shocked, reverent disbelief. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered, the name a ghost in the quiet air of the store. Clara's heart stopped. For a moment, she was back there, the smell of smoke in the air, the weight of the gun in her hand. She wanted to deny it, to run. But she looked at his face, at the open, honest gratitude in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't. "My name is Anna now," she said quietly. That evening, he and his wife, Sarah, came to her small room. They did not speak of the fire, or of the guns. They spoke of the new life they had built. They told her about Sanctuary, how it was thriving, how the people there spoke of the mysterious woman who had saved them as a hero, a legend. "They say you were an angel of justice," Sarah said, her eyes shining with tears. "You gave us all a second chance." Clara listened, a profound, aching sorrow and a small, fragile flicker of warmth warring in her heart. She had tried to bury the widow, to forget the blood and the violence. But here was the living proof that her actions had not been entirely of the darkness. She had not just been an avenger. She had been a protector. The presence of Samuel and his family changed things for her. Her past was no longer a secret to be buried, but a complex, painful part of who she was. She could not escape it, so she would have to learn to live with it. She slowly, tentatively, began to let the world in. She started to speak to her neighbors. She allowed herself a small smile at a child's antics. The woman who had been frozen in grief was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to thaw. Years passed. The town of Haven, Oregon grew, and the woman known as Anna became a quiet, respected part of its fabric. She never married. She never spoke of her past. But she became known for her quiet strength, her deep and spoken kindness, and the profound, sorrowful wisdom in her eyes. She was the woman people came to when they were in trouble, when they needed a steady hand or a quiet, listening ear. She fought her battles now not with a gun, but with compassion, with a fierce, protective instinct for the small, fragile community she had come to call home. She never forgot Ben. His memory was no longer a source of burning pain, but a quiet, enduring presence, a moral compass that guided her. She lived the life of peace he had dreamed of, in her own, solitary way. One day, a young, hot-headed deputy rode into town, chasing a gang of ruthless bank robbers. The gang holed up in the town's hotel, taking hostages. The town was paralyzed with fear. The young deputy, outmanned and outgunned, was at a loss. He went to Anna. Everyone knew that if there was a problem that couldn't be solved, you went to the quiet seamstress. He told her the situation, his voice a mixture of bravado and raw fear. Clara listened, her face calm, her hands still. She looked at the young lawman, at his earnest, terrified face, and she saw the ghost of her own Ben. She knew what she had to do. She did not pick up a gun. She walked out into the main street, alone, and armed. She walked toward the hotel, a figure of impossible, quiet courage. The robbers, seeing her, shouted warnings, fired a shot into the air. She did not stop. She stood in the street in front of the hotel and she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with a strange, compelling authority. She did not threaten them. She did not plead. She simply told them a story. She told them the story of a woman who had lost everything to violence, who had spent years paying a debt of blood, only to find that the vengeance she sought had cost her her own soul. "There are two kinds of graves in this world," she said, her voice echoing in the tense silence. "The ones you dig for others, and the one you dig for yourself with every act of violence. I know. I have dug both. The one you dig for yourself is the deeper, and the lonelier, of the two. Walk out of that hotel now, and your story can still have a different ending. Stay, and it will end, as all such stories do, in blood and dust and regret." The outlaws, who had been prepared for a gunfight, were disarmed by her words, by the profound, undeniable truth in her voice. They saw in her not a target, but a grim portent of their own future. After a long, tense silence, they threw down their guns and surrendered. Clara turned and walked away before the deputy could even thank her. She went back to her small room, her heart aching with the weight of the memories she had been forced to unearth. She had not used a gun, but she had used the widow one last time. She had used the weight of her own painful past as a weapon for peace. The next morning, as the sun rose, casting a clean, new light over the quiet town, she knew it was time to move on. Her past would always be a part of her, a shadow she could never outrun. But she could choose not to live in it. She packed a small bag. She left a note for the young deputy, a simple piece of advice. Justice is not about the punishment of the wicked, but about the protection of the good. She rode out of town, just as she had ridden out of so many others. But this time, she was not running. She was simply going. Her legend would remain, a whisper in the history of a half-dozen towns. The widow with the revolver. But the woman, Clara, was finally, truly, at peace. She rode toward the rising sun, a solitary figure seeking not a new life, but the quiet continuation of the one she had so painstakingly, and so honorably, reclaimed.